Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Middle Ages. That glorious 1,000-year stretch where people believed diseases were demons, cats were spies, and the cure for anything involved either prayer or setting something on fire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all began in July 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped out into the streets of Strasbourg and started dancing. No music, no audience, no apparent reason, just a one-woman rave in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. At first, people assumed she'd lost a bet or her mind. But when she kept dancing for days, her neighbours realised something far worse was happening. Exercise. Soon, dozens joined her, moving like they were possessed, twitching, stomping, collapsing, and occasionally dying mid-step. Contemporary reports say as many as 400 people were dancing uncontrollably. Because medieval Europe couldn't just have a nice summer, it had to host the first recorded silent disco of doom. Naturally, the authorities decided to help by doing something profoundly stupid. Instead of quarantining the dancers or, say, asking why everyone was convulsing, they built a stage and hired musicians. Yes, they turned mass hysteria into a civic festival. It was the only time in history where more cowbell was actually fatal advice. Theories vary. Some blame ergot poisoning caused by a hallucinogenic fungus on rye bread. In simpler terms, the entire town accidentally microdosed LSD. Others suggest it was mass psychogenic illness, meaning everyone went insane together. Medieval Europe's favourite group activity. Doctors, of course, blamed hot blood. Their solution? Make the dancers keep dancing to sweat it out. Because nothing cures exhaustion like more exhaustion. Meanwhile, priests claimed the townsfolk had offended Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancing, and sent them on a reluctant pilgrimage to his shrine. Imagine crawling for miles with blisters, delirium, and 16th century shoes. Holiness was optional. Misery was mandatory. Eventually, the dancers collapsed, the music stopped, and Strasbourg went back to normal, which in the 1500s still meant plague, famine, and bad dental care. But the legend stuck. Historians now call it mass hysteria, though it's hard to say what's crazier. People dancing themselves to death, or their government doubling down with live entertainment. And that, my friends, is how the Middle Ages invented both rave culture and public health failure in the same week. In 897 AD, the Catholic Church decided to take drama to a level usually reserved for bad reality TV. It began when Pope Stephen VI decided that simply disliking his predecessor wasn't enough. He had to prosecute his corpse. Yes, you heard that right. The late Pope Formosus had been dead for about 9 months when Stephen ordered him dug up, dressed in papal robes, and dragged into court. The event became known as the Cadaver Synod, or, as it should have been called, Keeping Up with the Popes, Exhumed Edition. The trial opened with the deceased Formosus sitting upright on a throne, his skeletal remains wobbling under the weight of his vestments. A deacon was appointed to speak for the defendant, which feels unnecessary since the defendant's tongue had decayed 6 months prior. Witnesses gasped as Stephen screamed accusations at the corpse, perjury, ambition, and the mortal sin of existing before Stephen did. The outcome, of course, was predetermined. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. His papal garments were ripped off, his blessing fingers cut off, as if he might still try to bless someone, and his corpse was tossed unceremoniously into the Tiber River. For a brief moment, Stephen must have felt triumphant, until everyone else realised their pope had just publicly bullied a corpse. Riots broke out. The clergy called it an embarrassment. The people called it Tuesday. Eventually, Stephen himself was imprisoned and strangled to death in his cell, presumably by someone who preferred their popes alive. The whole episode revealed what medieval politics were really about. Personal grudges, holy theatrics, and absolutely no adult supervision. Historians later suggested that the Cadaver Synod was fueled by power struggles between rival factions. But honestly, it reads like one man's descent into divine madness. It's proof that even in the age of faith, humans were still petty, bored, and disturbingly creative. So next time you see workplace drama, take comfort. At least your boss isn't exhuming former employees to yell at them. In the end, Pope Formosus was quietly reburied and re-blessed by later popes, proving that even in the church, bad management decisions eventually get reversed. Medieval rumour had it that when powerful churchmen died, their bodies sometimes exploded. Most dismissed it as tavern talk, the kind of story you tell after your third ale. Unfortunately for William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester, and later Henry de Blois, his illustrious predecessor, history suggests there may have been a literal bang behind the legend. Here's the setup. In the 12th century, embalming wasn't an exact science. You drained a bit of blood, sprinkled some herbs, maybe waved a Bible at the corpse, and hoped for the best. Then, you sealed the body in a lead coffin under a hot stone cathedral, where air circulation was a myth. A few weeks later, nature called loudly. Chroniclers recorded that one of the bishops of Winchester was laid to rest in the heat of midsummer, and within days his tomb began groaning. Monks claimed it was his soul escaping purgatory. More likely, it was methane escaping everywhere else. When the lid finally cracked, the stench was so bad that several witnesses fell to their knees and repented. Not from faith, from nausea. Word spread that the bishop had burst for his sins. Pilgrims came to pray over the miracle. Priests, never missing a branding opportunity, started calling it divine punishment for greed. The cathedral quietly replaced the tiles, and no one talked about it again, except every gossip within 200 miles. Forensic historians now think the legend came from real accidents during medieval burials. Corpses sealed too tightly would swell with gas until the coffin split open or exploded. The church naturally spun this into theology, a convenient warning against pride, gluttony, and eating salted meat in July. It's a perfect snapshot of medieval logic. Something disgusting happens, everyone panics, and the explanation somehow involves God's opinion on dinner portions. Modern scientists call it decomposition. Medieval chroniclers called it the wrath of heaven. Either way, the result was the same. An unforgettable reminder that even the holiest among us are one bad summer away from becoming a cautionary tale. In an age where most people couldn't read but everyone could panic, few rumours spread faster than the idea that the Holy Communion wafers, those little discs of sanctified bread, were bleeding. Yes, bleeding. According to the faithful, these weren't just symbolic morsels, they were literal slices of Christ, and occasionally they bled to prove it. The first reports popped up across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. A priest would drop a wafer, stab it with a knife, presumably by accident, and it would start oozing red. Instead of asking obvious questions like, "Is it possible I've just cut my finger?" the clergy concluded it was a miracle, because in medieval logic, everything that wasn't immediately explainable was either divine or demonic, rarely anything in between. One famous case occurred in Bolsena, Italy, around 1263, when a priest doubting the doctrine of transubstantiation, the idea that bread literally becomes Christ's body, saw his wafer bleed onto the altar cloth mid-mass. His disbelief turned into instant terror, as it does when your lunch starts hemorrhaging. The cloth was rushed to Pope Urban IV, who promptly declared it a miracle. He even built a church, Orvieto Cathedral, to commemorate the occasion. It's still there, part basilica, part blood-stained souvenir shop. Of course, centuries later, science had the audacity to ruin everything. Microbiologists discovered a cheerful red bacterium called Serratia marcescens. It thrives on moist bread and produces a red pigment. Translation: the blood of Christ was just an enthusiastic case of food poisoning. But in the Middle Ages, no one wanted to hear that. Bleeding wafers drew crowds. Pilgrims came to witness them, toss coins, and leave with holy crumbs, the original miracle merch. The The church leaned in hard. Every oozing wafer was another sign that faith worked, even if biology was quietly disagreeing in the corner. So yes, the legend of the bleeding bread turned out to be true, just not the kind of truth the clergy wanted. It wasn't proof of God's mystery, it was proof that refrigeration had yet to be invented. If divine intervention smells slightly sour and grows in damp cupboards, maybe holiness just needs better storage conditions. In the Grand Museum of Medieval Nightmares, few exhibits are as upsetting or as weirdly specific as the Rat King, a tangled mass of rats whose tails have somehow fused together, forcing them to move as one horrible, squeaking organism. The people of Lübeck, a proud German trading city, swore they'd seen them during outbreaks of plague. The rats would appear tangled and shrieking, dragging each other across the floor like a furry hydra of disease. Scholars dismissed it as tavern gossip. After all, medieval Europe already had enough horrors without inventing new ones. But as it turns out, the legend was disgustingly true. In 1828, long after the Middle Ages, a farmer near Buchheim discovered a real rat king. 32 rodents fused by tails hardened with dirt, blood, and body fluids. They were preserved and displayed in the Museum of Natural History in Altenburg, where they remain to this day, presumably plotting revenge. So yes, the medieval peasants weren't imagining things, they were just having the worst week ever. Modern science says rat kings happen when young rats are trapped in a nest coated with sticky substances, sap, excrement, or freezing mud, and their tails knot together. As they grow, the tangle tightens, bones fuse, and nature quietly gives up on quality control. It's the rodent equivalent of a group chat you can never leave. To medieval minds, though, this was no accident. It was an omen, a living symbol of plague and sin. If you saw a rat king, it meant God was angry, the devil was laughing, and you should probably start digging your own grave just to save time. Chroniclers even described towns burning entire cellars to purge the wrath of vermin. Historians love to scoff at such superstition, but really, who wouldn't panic if 30 rats walked by like some grotesque parade float of disease? The legend, disturbingly, wasn't exaggerated. The peasants really did see a writhing mass of rats knotted by fate, and the next day, half the town would be coughing blood. Sometimes folklore doesn't lie. It just leaves out the smell. If you ever find yourself in Wales and see a sign for Holywell, you might assume it's just another village with an overachieving church. But this one earned its name the hard way, by sprouting from a decapitated saint. The story goes back to the 7th century, when a nobleman named Caradoc developed a crush on a pious young woman called Winifred. She wasn't interested, probably because she had standards, and fled toward a chapel where her uncle, Saint Buno, was praying. Caradoc, demonstrating medieval courtship at its finest, responded by chopping off her head. Immediately, a spring burst from the ground where it fell, turning tragedy into tourism. Buno, apparently unfazed by decapitation, picked up her head, stuck it back on, and performed a miracle-level CPR. Winifred survived long enough to become a nun, a saint, and the patron of people who've had an objectively worse day than you. Over the centuries, the spring at Holywell became one of Britain's most visited pilgrimage sites, nicknamed the Lords of Wales. Kings, commoners, and the occasional sinner dipped themselves in its icy waters hoping for healing. Chroniclers claimed it cured blindness, paralysis, and even bad marriages. Modern science would call that placebo, but medievals called it hope. Then came the Reformation, when every miracle was suddenly suspiciously Catholic. Reformers tried to close the shrine, drain the well, and debunk the legend, only for the spring to keep gushing defiantly, as if God himself refused to be audited. Pilgrims kept sneaking back, dunking themselves under cover of darkness like holy rebels. Today, the well still flows, a bubbling relic of superstition and survival. Scientists tested it and found the water rich in minerals, iron and trace elements that could, technically, promote healing. Which means everyone's been arguing for 300 years about whether it's a divine miracle or just really good geology. Either way, St. Winifred got the last laugh. Her legend turned a gruesome murder into a national spa day, and her well continues to draw believers, skeptics, and people who just like a good soak in cold water. Moral of the story: don't underestimate a woman with faith, family connections, and a naturally pressurized spring on her side. If you ever feel your workplace drama is bad, remember the Knights Templar, the only organization in history that went from heroes of the Crusades to heretics on fire in under a century. The Templars began as holy warriors sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, they evolved into the medieval version of a multinational bank, loaning kings money, building fortresses, and inventing the concept of interest rates, which everyone loved right up until they owed them money. By the early 1300s, they had wealth, influence, and matching outfits. 3 things, guaranteed to make any monarch insecure. Enter King Philip the Fair of France, a man so broke he once pawned his own crown, and so petty he makes modern politicians look like philosophers. He owed the Templars a small fortune and decided that paying them back was unchristian. Arresting them, torturing them, and stealing everything they owned, however, was apparently very Christian. So in 1307, Philip ordered every Templar in France arrested on the same day, a move that can only be described as the original Friday the 13th disaster. The charges: heresy, idol worship, and, of course, kissing each other's feet. You know, the usual medieval HR complaints. The imprisoned knights confessed to everything, mainly because medieval interrogation techniques involved hot irons and zero anesthesia. Their leader, Jacques de Molay, was eventually burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. And here's where the legend ignites. According to witnesses, as the flames rose, de Molay cursed the king and the pope, summoning both to meet him before God within the year. It sounds theatrical, until both men actually died within that time frame. Philip's death was particularly embarrassing, thrown from his horse during a hunt, proving that even French royalty couldn't outmaneuver gravity. The church tried to bury the incident and everything else, but the damage was done. Europe whispered that the Templars' vengeance had begun, and their curse lingered for generations. Some even linked it to the downfall of the French monarchy centuries later. Poetic justice in slow motion. Whether you call it divine retribution or pure coincidence, the story stuck. The Templars went up in flames, but their reputation refused to burn out. Moral of the story: never cross a man with a sword, a grudge, and a flair for dramatic last words. The Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing so many people that God started getting performance reviews. Amid the chaos appeared one of history's most unsettling fashion icons, the Plague Doctor. Long leather coat, wide-brimmed hat, and a beaked mask that made him look like a demonic stork who'd quit mid-career. The outfit was meant to protect doctors from miasma, the bad air everyone blamed for disease. Germ theory wouldn't exist for another 500 years, so if something smelled awful, it was clearly death itself floating by. The beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, and sometimes vinegar-soaked cloth to purify the air. Basically, medieval aromatherapy with anxiety. The result: a physician who looked like he'd wandered out of a nightmare with a bag full of screams. The long coat was waxed to resist infection, the gloves sealed tight, and the staff used to poke patients from a safe distance, because nothing says bedside manner like treating your patients with the same stick you use for stray dogs. Ironically, the plague doctors were often not trained physicians. Many were random volunteers or barber surgeons looking for extra income and minimal proximity. Cities hired them when everyone else either died or ran away. Their job description was simple: record deaths, lance buboes, and not faint. They were paid handsomely, though the contract often included no touching, no quitting, and no suing God. And while the look became legendary, the results were mixed. The waxed leather helped a little. The mask, not at all. Plague doctors still caught the disease with impressive efficiency, proving that fashion can't save you from biology. But the image stuck, a terrifying symbol of survival, science, and utter confusion. When modern historians first found descriptions of the plague doctor's costume, they assumed it was a myth, until preserved examples turned up in archives and paintings confirmed the horror. Medieval Europe really did put its faith in a man who looked like a crow auditioning for a tragedy. So yes, the legend was true. The doctors weren't angels of mercy. They were the Middle Ages answer to, what if your worst nightmare had a clipboard? And frankly, given the state of public health back then, it was an improvement. Long before ghost hunting TV shows and night vision cameras, the Welsh countryside already had its own brand of supernatural tourism, the corpse lights. People in medieval Wales swore they saw glowing orbs floating above roads and graveyards, drifting silently through the night like lanterns carried by invisible hands. They weren't just spooky, they were prophetic. According to local law, if you saw a corpse light, it meant someone nearby was about to die. Nothing like a floating pre-death notification to spice up your evening walk. The lights were said to vary in size, small ones for infants, large ones for adults, because even the paranormal world respected medieval demographics. Witnesses described them weaving along paths that later became funeral routes, hovering over streams before disappearing. To villagers, that was solid evidence of divine involvement. To modern scientists, it was more like flammable gas plus bad weather. See, in the centuries before chemistry was a thing, people had no idea that decomposing organic matter releases phosphine and methane, which can spontaneously ignite in damp conditions. Today, we call it swamp gas. Back then, it was death whispering hello. The scientific explanation didn't arrive until the 19th century, but medieval peasants didn't need science. They had eyewitness accounts, ale, and a collective sense of dread. The church, of course, had opinions. Some priests claimed the lights were angels guiding souls. Others insisted they were demons luring travellers to their doom, because medieval theology rarely passed up an opportunity to make things worse. Either way, the phenomenon terrified people into confession, which the clergy considered a win. The stories persisted for centuries. Even as late as the 1600s, scholars wrote about ignis fatuus, or foolish fire, still visible in rural areas. Farmers blamed fairies, monks blamed sin, and everyone blamed whales. Modern researchers eventually proved the peasants were half right. The lights did exist, just not because heaven had a lantern budget. The real culprit was rotting vegetation doing its best impression of divine warning. So yes, the medieval corpse lights were real, just slightly less supernatural than advertised. It turns out the Grim Reaper didn't need to carry a lantern after all. The bogs were doing it for him. And if you ever see one yourself, congratulations. You've just experienced a 1,000-year-old chemistry lesson with extra atmosphere. If you've ever seen one of those medieval murals filled with skeletons holding hands and waltzing around priests and kings, congratulations. You've met the Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death. It was basically the Middle Ages version of a motivational poster, except instead of live, laugh, love, it said, you're next. The legend claimed that at midnight, the dead rose from their graves to dance in the churchyard. Skeletons, nobles, peasants, all locking arms in a grotesque conga line of equality. The message was clear. No matter your title, status, or dental plan, death doesn't discriminate. It was grim, yes, but also the most honest thing medieval Europe ever produced. The story began circulating after the Black Death wiped out a third of the continent. People needed a way to explain why their neighbours, their priests, and their favourite innkeepers kept dying, so they did what humans always do, turned trauma into art. Artists across France and Germany painted skeletal processions on chapel walls, some even labelling the corpses as kings, knights, or popes to drive the point home. A few added musicians because, apparently, nothing says existential dread like a skeleton on drums. To medieval peasants, these murals weren't morbid. They were comforting. Death was everywhere, so it might as well have choreography. It became a communal myth. Villagers swore they heard faint music from cemeteries at night or saw bones shifting in the moonlight. In Paris, people claimed to have witnessed full-on skeleton festivals. The church called it blasphemy. The peasants called it relatable. Modern historians believe the dancing dead sightings were optical illusions, moonlight, fog, and rotting corpses doing what rotting corpses do. But honestly, if you'd lived through 3 plagues and 14 inquisitions, you might have seen things too. Over time, the danse macabre spread across Europe, from frescoes and tapestries to church carvings and even stage plays. It was the medieval world's most successful franchise, reminding everyone that life was short, hygiene optional, and humour essential. So yes, the stories of dancing skeletons were technically true, not because the bones moved, but because people did. Every dance, feast, and prayer in medieval Europe was a defiant 2-step against the inevitable. The skeletons didn't need to rise. They were already inside everyone, patiently waiting for their cue. In the medieval imagination, hell wasn't some distant metaphysical realm. It was just a bad neighbourhood with lava. Travellers' accounts spoke of real places where the earth hissed, the air burned, and the locals swore you could hear the souls of the damned. One such spot gained particular notoriety. A lake in Iceland, said to boil with the cries of sinners. The legend began with early Christian missionaries who landed on the volcanic island, looked around at the steaming craters, and reasonably concluded they'd overshot heaven. The earth gurgled, the ground smoked, and pools bubbled like cauldrons. Clearly this was hell leaking through, because when you've spent your life in cold monasteries, geothermal activity just feels personal. Word spread fast. Chroniclers described waters that burn and stones that hiss like serpents. Pilgrims avoided the area, sailors gave it wide berth, and theologians debated whether it was an entrance to damnation or simply God's very angry tea kettle. The name Haveravelir, meaning hot springs plain, entered folklore as a literal gateway to the underworld. Later visitors claimed to hear screams echoing through the steam. Locals, ever practical, said it was just gas escaping from deep fissures. Either way, Iceland got branded as the real estate development directly above perdition. Medieval mapmakers even labelled parts of it Inferno Nordico, Northern Hell. You have to admire the commitment to marketing. When science finally caught up centuries later, geologists explained the phenomenon. Magma-heated groundwater turning lakes into bubbling basins of boiling death. Perfectly natural. But that didn't make it less terrifying to anyone standing nearby with a fragile belief system and no sunscreen. What's impressive is how long the legend endured. Even into the 17th century, European travellers kept returning home with fresh tales of boiling pits that roared like demons. And honestly, if you'd spent 2 weeks at sea eating salted herring, you'd probably start hallucinating Judgment Day too. So yes, the boiling lake of hell existed, though the screams of the damned were really sulphur vents doing their best impression of human regret. Still, you have to hand it to the medieval mind. When faced with a volcano, they didn't panic, they theologized. And somehow, that feels very human. For centuries, the people of Venice whispered that their city, a floating paradise of masks, canals, and questionable sanitation, was also home to vampires. Not the elegant poetry-reading kind. These were plague-bitten corpses who allegedly rose from their shallow graves to feed on the living. The legend began during the Black Death, when burial pits overflowed and people started noticing something horrifying. Some bodies looked disturbed. Shrouds were torn, faces bloated, and dark fluids leaked from mouths. Lacking access to science or common sense, the gravediggers concluded the corpses were eating. Naturally, the only solution was to shove a brick in their mouths. Problem solved. For centuries, this sounded like a wild medieval rumour. The sort of thing you'd expect from a civilization that also believed frogs caused storms. But in 2006, archaeologists excavating a plague pit on the Venetian island of Lazaretto Nuovo found a real skeleton with a brick jammed between its teeth. The tabloids went feral. The legend of the vampire of Venice had just gone from folklore to field report. Forensic analysis revealed the vampire was a woman, about 60 years old, which, in the 14th century, was roughly the lifespan of a minor deity. The brick experts explained, was an early attempt at preventing corpses from spreading disease. People thought the plague was caused by revenant breath, the idea that dead bodies exhaled contagion. Blocking the mouth stopped the undead, or so they hoped. Medieval public health at its finest. No soap, just masonry. It was a perfect storm of ignorance and imagination. The corpse's decomposing face had produced gases, which made the shroud tear and bloat. Gravediggers interpreted the gory mess as evidence of feeding, and since you can't arrest a dead person, they went straight for the DIY vampire dentistry solution. The discovery shocked no one familiar with medieval logic. Venice had survived floods, fires, and fashion trends made of lead. A vampire seemed entirely plausible. So yes, the vampire of Venice was real, at least in bone and brick. Not a creature of the night, just a casualty of misunderstanding. And honestly, it's hard to blame them. If your entire city smelled like a damp tomb and everyone you knew was dying, you'd probably start putting rocks in corpses' mouths too. In the year 1284, the citizens of Bologna looked up to the sky and saw something deeply unholy. No, it wasn't divine revelation. It was meat. Actual chunks of raw flesh falling from the heavens like some nightmarish medieval charcuterie. Eyewitnesses swore it rained for several minutes, because apparently Italy just refuses to do anything halfway. The event was recorded by monks who described a shower of bloody meat that covered the countryside. People collected the chunks, and being medieval Europeans immediately started arguing about whether to eat them. Scholars debated if it was angelic manna or a warning from God. Some claimed it was flesh from fallen sinners. Others suggested, optimistically, that it might be pork. Modern science, sadly, has ruined the fun again. Historians and zoologists now suspect the phenomenon was caused by flocks of birds, most likely vultures, vomiting mid-flight. It's disgusting, but also deeply on-brand for nature. When startled or overfed, scavenger birds tend to eject stomach contents to lighten their load. So, in essence, Bologna experienced the first recorded case of aerial food delivery. But to medieval minds, there was no logical explanation, just divine symbolism and mild hysteria. Priests warned it was an omen of sin. Alchemists tried to preserve samples, hoping to find gold inside. Spoiler, they didn't. Farmers prayed for forgiveness. Butchers prayed for more of it. The bishop reportedly declared a day of fasting, which feels counterproductive when meat is literally falling from the sky. Even centuries later, the legend persisted. Renaissance chroniclers described it in solemn Latin, perhaps to disguise how absurd it was, and in true medieval fashion, no one ever cleaned it up properly. You can picture the scene: a quiet village, confused peasants, a rain of meat cubes, and one monk frantically trying to take notes while dodging brisket. It's easy to laugh now, but the flesh rain wasn't unique. Similar incidents were reported elsewhere: frogs in France, fish in Scotland, worms in Norway. The Middle Ages were basically one long episode of weather gone wrong. So yes, it really did rain meat in Bologna. Not the wrath of God, just the stomach of a stressed-out bird squadron. If nothing else, it proves that in medieval Europe, every miracle had an odour. And some were definitely past their expiration date. In the medieval world, people didn't trust competence. If something worked too well, it had to be witchcraft. Enter the legend of the Devil's Bridge, or rather, dozens of them. From France to Wales to Switzerland, nearly every village with a well-built bridge insisted it had been designed by Satan himself. Apparently, masonry was above the pay grade of mortals. The story always went something like this. Villagers needed a bridge over a gorge, river, or suspiciously bottomless ravine. After several failed attempts, and probably a few lost masons, they called upon the devil. He agreed to build it overnight, in exchange for the soul of the first creature to cross it. Reasonable rates for medieval Europe. The villagers, being experts in loopholes and livestock, usually sent a goat or dog across first. This enraged the devil, who'd spent the night showing off his portfolio of Gothic architecture, only to end up with a goat for payment. Furious, he either smashed the bridge, unsuccessfully, or vanished in a puff of sulphur. leaving the villagers with a free piece of infrastructure and a slightly traumatized animal. The most famous example stands in Lugano, Switzerland, a perfect stone arch so impossibly precise that locals still call it Ponte del Diavolo. In Wales, there's another, the Devil's Bridge of Ceredigion, built over a roaring waterfall. According to legend, the devil himself came to collect his due, only to be tricked by an old woman's dog. To be fair, no one outsmarts Satan quite like a Welsh grandma. Modern archaeologists, buzzkills that they are, point out that medieval stonemasons were just really good at their jobs. The bridges used ingenious keystones, symmetry, and pressure distribution. Proof of advanced engineering, not infernal subcontracting. But in a world where people thought lightning was God's punctuation, demons built it, was a perfectly acceptable hypothesis. Today, there are over 50 Devil's Bridges across Europe, each one a monument to humanity's long, loving relationship with paranoia and clever storytelling. So yes, the bridges were real. The devil probably wasn't, unless he also worked part-time as a civil engineer. Either way, the moral is clear. If you ever build something too good, expect credit from Satan, and maybe keep a goat handy, just in case. If you were a monk in medieval Yorkshire, nights at Byland Abbey were not as peaceful as Gregorian chants suggest. After dark, witnesses claimed the abbey came alive with groans, whispers, and the distinct sound of chains scraping across stone. Not metaphorical chains, mind you, literal ones. Thus began the tale of the ghost monk of Byland, one of the oldest recorded hauntings in England and the most bureaucratic. In the 1400s, a scribe at Byland decided to document the abbey's many ghostly encounters. He didn't just jot them down, he catalogued them like divine case files, 20 separate hauntings, each complete with names, dates, and theological footnotes. The monks at Byland, it turns out, were living in a holy haunted house. The most famous of these was the chained monk, a spirit said to rise nightly from a forgotten crypt beneath the cloisters, muttering prayers and dragging his own iron bonds behind him. Medieval monks were not subtle storytellers. According to the account, one brave brother finally confronted the ghost. When asked why he couldn't rest, the apparition explained, in flawless Latin of course, that he had died with unconfessed sins. The chain was his penance. He begged for prayers, absolution, and, ideally, less attention from screaming novices. After the community held a special mass for his soul, the monk vanished, leaving behind only his rattling chain. And presumably, several traumatized witnesses. Historians love this story, because it's one of the first ghost tales written as fact rather than folklore. The monk didn't appear as a cautionary symbol. He was treated like a parishioner with unfinished paperwork. It perfectly captures the medieval worldview. Ghosts weren't horror movie monsters. They were sinners waiting for customer service. Excavations centuries later found a real crypt beneath Byland Abbey, with human remains bound in corroded iron links. Whether it was a relic of penance, imprisonment, or simple superstition, no one knows. But it gave the legend just enough evidence to crawl out of the realm of myth. Before the first frost even touched the fields, medieval peasants began to panic quietly. They didn't fear the cold itself. They feared the emptiness it brought to their tables. The harvest marked not just celebration, but calculation. How many sacks of grain could last until spring? How many turnips could be hidden in the cellar? And which pig had to die so that the others, and the family, might live? Winter wasn't poetic, nor romantic. It was a drawn-out test of cunning and discipline where food preservation was the difference between survival and starvation. A medieval peasant couldn't simply store food. Every crumb demanded strategy. Bread grew mould, milk spoiled, and fresh meat turned into rot within days. Without ice or refrigeration, peasants turned to the wisdom of the past. Preservation methods passed down like family heirlooms. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting became sacred rituals. Salt was so valuable it was called white gold, and its grains determined who survived the season and who didn't. Peasants rubbed it into meat and fish until they were dry and leathery, then hung them above smoky fires, where the combination of salt and smoke created flavors that lasted months, even years. The daily routine of preserving food became an act of faith. Barrels of cabbage bubbled into sour, tangy sauerkraut, a miracle of fermentation that peasants barely understood, yet relied upon completely. Turnips, onions, and beans were pickled in sour brine or stored in earthen jars buried underground to escape frost. Nothing was wasted. Animal fat became candle fuel. Bones flavoured soups until they dissolved. Even spoiled ale found purpose, used to soften bread so hard it could chip a tooth. When snow blanketed the fields, the real test began. Families gathered around the hearth, gnawing on salted pork or sipping thin broth made from dried peas. They rationed carefully, always aware that spring was months away, and famine only one careless meal distant. Yet there was pride in their ingenuity, in turning decay into sustenance, in transforming scarcity into survival. For peasants, every preserved morsel was a victory over time itself, and in a world ruled by hunger, victory, however small, was enough to keep hope alive. If there was one ingredient that could decide whether a medieval family made it through the winter, it wasn't bread or meat, it was salt. That humble white crystal was more precious than gold in its time, traded, hoarded, and even fought over. Salt was the foundation of medieval food preservation, and peasants treated it with near religious reverence. Without it, pork turned sour, fish went bad, and entire cellars of effort could vanish in a single warm week. Salting wasn't just sprinkling, it was ritual. After slaughtering season in late autumn, families gathered to carve every inch of meat into manageable slabs. Each piece was buried in coarse salt, packed tightly in barrels or clay pots. The salt drew out every drop of moisture, robbing bacteria of the damp paradise it needed to thrive. Days later, the meat would be rinsed, dried, and sometimes hung over the hearth, where the rising smoke added another layer of defence, and a smoky perfume that defined the flavour of medieval life. Fish was treated even more carefully. Inland villagers relied on dried or salted herring that arrived from the coasts, preserved so thoroughly that it was more plank than flesh. To eat it, peasants had to soak it for hours just to make it chewable, yet they cherished every bite. It wasn't just nutrition, it was proof that human ingenuity could defy nature's cruelty. Salt also extended to vegetables and dairy. Cabbage leaves and turnips were salted before fermentation, while butter was mixed with salt and packed into wooden tubs to survive through the lean months. The result wasn't gourmet cuisine, but it was reliable, and reliability was worth more than luxury. The irony was that peasants worked the fields that produced salt, yet rarely owned it. Heavy taxes made it a luxury even for those who mined or carried it. Some stretched it with ash or sand to make it last longer. Still, they guarded their salt barrels like treasure chests, because in a world where famine lurked at every door, salt wasn't just a preservative, it was life itself, grain by grain, and each handful brought another day of hope. When salt ran short, and it often did, peasants turned to the hearth. Smoke, that grey ghost rising from every chimney, became their next ally in the endless war against decay. Smoking wasn't just cooking, it was slow alchemy. Meat hung from rafters for days or even weeks, slowly turning from raw pink to deep mahogany, as curls of wood smoke whispered through the cottage. What emerged wasn't just edible, it was immortal, or at least as close to immortal as medieval peasants could hope for. Every household fire told a story of survival. In a world without chimneys as we know them, smoke filled the rafters, staining the walls black and the ceilings dark as tar. But that smoke did more than choke lungs. It coated meat in a natural armour. The compounds from burning wood killed bacteria and sealed in flavour. Pork, mutton, and even fish took on a toughness and aroma that made mouths water and bellies quiet for a while. Different woods gave different characters to the food. Oak and beech were the peasants' favourites, common, steady burners that gave a mellow, nutty taste. Applewood was a rare treat, lending sweetness to pork when available. Every village had its own subtle, signature smoke, depending on what trees grew nearby. And though no one could explain the science of phenols or dehydration, they understood the result. Smoked meat meant survival through February. The process was messy, smoky, and exhausting. Peasants had to keep the fire low and steady, never letting it flame up and burn the meat. Women and children took turns tending the smokehouse, their eyes stinging, their clothes reeking of fire for weeks. The air inside was thick enough to chew, but so was the satisfaction when the job was done. Rows of hanging meat symbolized triumph, a visible reminder that hunger could be postponed, if not defeated. Smoked foods became staples in stews and porridges throughout winter. Even scraps, bits too small to smoke whole, were saved for flavoring soups or mixed with grains. Nothing was wasted. Not fat, not bones, not time. In the medieval mind, smoke wasn't just a byproduct of fire. It was a sacred gift from the hearth, invisible, relentless, and life-saving. Before science had names for yeast or bacteria, peasants were already taming them. Fermentation was their invisible ally, a quiet, bubbling miracle that turned spoilage into sustenance. Nobody understood how it worked, but everyone knew it worked. When food began to fizz or sour, that wasn't always a disaster. Sometimes it was the start of transformation. Take cabbage, for instance. A humble, unassuming vegetable that could turn into a lifesaver. Peasants shredded it, salted it, and pressed it into wooden barrels. Weeks later, what emerged was sauerkraut. Sour, sharp, and surprisingly full of life. It didn't just taste better than rotting leaves. It kept better. In the middle of winter, when everything else was grey and lifeless, a spoonful of sauerkraut brought a punch of flavour and a whisper of health. Without knowing why, peasants had created a probiotic marvel centuries before scientists named it. The same magic touched milk. When fresh milk curdled, peasants didn't throw it away. They pressed it into cheese. The transformation was simple, yet revolutionary. Cheese could last months, even years, depending on how it was aged. A wheel of hard cheese hanging from the rafters was as good as a gold coin. Fermented drinks also found their place. Ale, mead, and cider brewed from leftover grains and fruits. These weren't luxuries, they were sterilized water substitutes, safer to drink than what came from the well. Fermentation also brought community. Every village smelled faintly of bubbling brine, rising dough, or brewing ale. Housewives shared starter cultures the way modern neighbours share recipes. Monks took the process to new heights, perfecting beer and cheese that would become famous across Europe. But for peasants, fermentation wasn't craft. It was instinct. It was also rebellion against decay. To take food that wanted to rot and convince it to transform instead, that was sorcery in its purest form. Through salt, air, and patience, peasants preserved not just nourishment, but hope. The world outside could freeze, the fields could sleep under snow, but inside the crocks and barrels, life went on, quietly, invisibly, and beautifully alive. If salt was gold and smoke was armour, then brine was magic. Pickling was one of the most ingenious tools in a peasant's arsenal, a way to trap summer inside a jar. With little more than water, salt, vinegar, and thyme, peasants could turn limp vegetables into crisp, tangy treasures that lasted until the thaw. When fresh greens became rare as miracles, a sour turnip could taste like salvation. Pickling began in late autumn, when gardens offered their last gasp. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, carrots, garlic. Nothing escaped the brine. Families gathered around large barrels, chopping vegetables into rough chunks. Saltwater brine or vinegar mixtures were poured over them, and sometimes herbs were thrown in for flavour. Dill, mustard seed, or wild garlic if available. The smell was strong enough to drive away rats and perhaps small children, but it was the smell of survival. The science was simple, though they didn't know it. Acid and salt created an environment where bacteria that caused rot couldn't thrive. Instead, friendly bacteria took over, transforming vegetables into sour, crunchy, vitamin-rich stores. In an age when scurvy and malnutrition were constant threats, pickled foods were lifesavers. Even the poorest families who couldn't afford much salt could still manage a few jars of brine, hidden away under floorboards or in cold corners. Pickling wasn't limited to vegetables either. Eggs, fish, and even leftover meat were sometimes sealed in vinegar or brine, though such experiments were risky and rarely delicious. Still, when desperation hit, flavour came second to preservation. The taste of brine, sharp, salty, and vinegary, became the taste of winter itself. For medieval peasants, every jar told a story. Each one represented a family's foresight, effort, and the stubborn refusal to give up comfort to hunger. And when a child opened a jar in mid-January and caught the scent of last autumn's harvest, it wasn't just food they tasted. It was memory. Pickling turned ordinary people into quiet alchemists, transforming decay into endurance. It was their way of defying nature's cruelty with nothing more than salt, patience, and an unshakable belief that spring would come again. Long before electricity or ovens, the medieval peasant learned to use the simplest element of all: air. Drying was preservation stripped to its essence. It didn't require salt, barrels, or brine, only patience and a bit of sun, wind, or fire. And for those too poor to afford much salt, drying became the last line of defence between a full stomach and starvation. Everything that could dry did. Apples were sliced thin and strung on twine, dangling above the hearth like garlands. Peas and beans were spread across woven mats to harden in the wind, while herbs, mint, thyme, rosemary, hung in clusters from roof beams, their scent blending with wood smoke and damp earth. Even mushrooms were threaded onto cords, turning leathery and dark as they slowly gave up their moisture. Dried food was light, compact, and resistant to the rot that thrived in moisture. Meat and fish, too, could be dried when salt was scarce. Thin cuts were laid across wooden racks, exposed to the breeze, sometimes brushed with vinegar or smoke for extra safety. In the colder months, drying happened indoors, near fires that stayed burning from dawn till dusk. The result wasn't exactly tender. A dried piece of beef could double as a weapon, but when rehydrated in stew, it became edible once more. For the medieval palate, edible was often good enough. Dried grains and legumes, however, were the true backbone of survival. Lentils, barley, and peas could be stored for years in sacks or clay jars. Peasants soaked them overnight, boiled them for hours, and stretched them with scraps of meat or turnips to feed whole families. These humble foods lacked glamour, but they outlasted the most extravagant feasts of the nobility. Drying was also a social ritual. Neighbours worked side by side, sharing fire pits and spreading produce in communal yards. Children turned fruit slices or watched for birds trying to steal them. Every flap of drying cloth, every hiss of steam from the hearth, carried a message of defiance. We will not starve this winter. Through drying, peasants learned to harness air itself, invisible, patient, and impartial, and turn it into armour against time. In a world that rotted quickly, dried food was a quiet promise. Life extended. Preservation didn't end once the food was cured, smoked, or dried. The next challenge was where to keep it safe. In a world before refrigeration, medieval peasants relied on the earth itself as their refrigerator. The ground was steady, cool, and dependable, so they built their storage not above it, but beneath it. The cellar was the silent guardian of the peasant household, a dark, damp sanctuary where food could outlast the sun. Every peasant home, no matter how humble, had some form of storage pit or root cellar. Some were little more than holes lined with straw and stones. Others were carefully dug underground chambers with wooden shelves and thatched roofs. These cellars stayed around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius even in the dead of winter, a perfect climate for preserving vegetables, grains, and salted meats. It was the medieval version of climate control, courtesy of nature. Root crops like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were buried in layers of sand or straw, which kept them from rotting or freezing. Cabbages were hung upside down from beams to slow decay. Onions and garlic dangled from ropes like garlands of survival, while barrels of sauerkraut and pickled beets sat against the wall, quietly bubbling through the winter. Every item had its place, not just for convenience, but to keep pests and mould at bay. The cellar also doubled as a time capsule of a family's labour. Each smell told a story: the sharp tang of vinegar, the smoky breath of cured meat, the earthy sweetness of stored apples. For peasants, entering the cellar was like stepping into their own museum of endurance. They measured wealth not in coins, but in the number of jars, sacks and barrels that could see them through till spring. In regions without solid ground or with flooding, peasants got creative, storing food in cool wells, shaded lofts, or even suspended baskets to keep rats out. Some even sealed grain in clay pots buried in the ground, where it could last for years if untouched. To survive a medieval winter wasn't just about hard work, it was about engineering. With smoke, salt, and the silent chill of the earth, peasants turned nature into their pantry. The cellar wasn't just storage, it was salvation. Food preservation in medieval villages wasn't just a household duty, it was a collective mission. When the harvest came in, no one worked alone. Families gathered in courtyards and barns, turning the yearly yield into a defence against hunger. It was a season of noise and motion, knives chopping, fires crackling, children running between barrels of brine and baskets of herbs. Preservation wasn't just about food, it was about community. Cooperation was essential. Peasants shared tools, salt and smokehouses because not every home could afford them. The village oven and smoke shed were lifelines, tended day and night by turns. Neighbours trusted each other's hands. Everyone had a role. One household might cure pork, another smoke fish, and others pickle vegetables for trade and barter. These shared efforts forged bonds stronger than feudal laws, born not from duty, but from necessity. The process also created a rhythm to rural life. Autumn meant slaughtering pigs, salting meat, and rendering fat into lard or tallow. Winter brought brewing, drying, and mending. Spring meant digging up the last buried roots and praying the barrels hadn't spoiled. Through it all, preservation linked one season to the next, turning scarcity into a kind of shared art form. It wasn't all grim necessity either. Communal preservation days often became small festivals. Songs filled the air as families prepared food together, laughing at missteps, like when someone spilled half a jar of precious vinegar, or when a stubborn goat escaped with a mouthful of cabbage. There was pride in knowing that one skill, salting, fermenting, or drying, might help feed another family through the snow. Even faith joined the work. Peasants sometimes blessed their stored food, or traced crosses into loaves of bread before drying them. Preservation wasn't just about keeping the body alive, it was about keeping the spirit hopeful. The shared smokehouses and pickling vats symbolized something larger than food. They represented unity in hardship. Through the long months of cold, when fields lay silent and the night seemed endless, the knowledge that your neighbour's hands had touched your food was comforting. It was proof that even in poverty, no one survived alone. Hunger divided people. Preservation brought them back together. For medieval peasants, waste was a sin against survival. Every crumb, bone, and scrap had a second life waiting for it. In a world where hunger was a yearly visitor, waste not, want not wasn't a saying, it was sacred law. To waste food meant tempting death itself. So peasants became masters of efficiency, turning what little they had into something that could feed them one more day. When a pig was slaughtered, nothing went to waste. The meat was salted, the fat rendered into lard, and the organs, liver, heart, and stomach were cooked the same day. Even the blood was used, mixed with oats and herbs to make blood pudding. The bones were boiled until soft, releasing every drop of fat into thin broth. When that was done, they were dried and burned for ash, which in turn became lye for soap. To a peasant, a pig wasn't just an animal. It was a survival kit, Vegetable scraps were saved for soups, peelings fed the chickens, and stale bread became pottage. A mush of everything edible simmered together. Nothing died alone in a peasant's kitchen. Everything merged into something else. Even spoiled ale could find purpose, poured over hard bread to soften it, or used as sour starter for vinegar. A forgotten jar of fermented cabbage wasn't a mistake. It was seasoning. Water, too, was precious. Since it was often unsafe to drink, broth and ale replaced it. Peasants recycled cooking water again and again, thickening it with barley or beans until it resembled glue more than soup. But that glue kept bellies full and spirits faintly alive through long, hungry nights. This fierce practicality wasn't born from cleverness alone. It came from centuries of necessity. Generations who'd faced famine and plague learned that abundance was fleeting and waste unforgivable. They built a culture of thrift where even ashes had meaning. And through that thrift, they found dignity. By the end of winter, when the last smoked hams hung brittle and the final onions sprouted in the dark, peasants didn't see deprivation. They saw victory. Every meal that stretched, every scrap reused, was proof of triumph over decay. In a cruel, cold world, survival itself was the grandest feast of all. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love. It was about leverage. To marry was to negotiate, to merge assets, and to secure alliances that could outlast generations. The noble wedding wasn't a private affair. It was a public contract. Kings used it to expand empires, dukes to acquire land, and peasants to ensure survival. The church might have preached holy matrimony, but behind the hymns lurked cold arithmetic. Among the upper classes, marriages were political chess moves. A French princess might find herself shipped to England at 14, promised to a boy she'd never met, all because her father needed peace with a rival kingdom. The church required consent, but consent in medieval Latin often translated to, "Your parents said yes." A woman's dowry, gold, land, or livestock, became her entry ticket into marriage, while the husband's title ensured her family's prestige. Love could come later, if at all. Even peasants approached marriage with pragmatism. Romance was nice, but survival was nicer. A man needed help tilling the fields and tending livestock. A woman needed protection and stability. Marrying young meant more hands for labour and children to support ageing parents. In most cases, affection grew out of shared work rather than poetry. The wedding feast was the rare indulgence. Ale flowed, bread was baked, and neighbours gossiped about who brought the biggest dowry. Then the real work began. Still, the church tried to keep order in these unions. Priests insisted on witnesses and public vows to prevent secret marriages that might disrupt inheritance claims. A couple needed to marry in daylight at the church door with the priest's blessing. Yet under the surface, the tension between religion and reality simmered. The church called marriage indissoluble, while nobles treated it as disposable when politics demanded. In essence, medieval marriage was less about emotion and more about obligation. Husbands saw wives as investments, wives viewed marriage as insurance, and the church saw it as a means to control desire. It was a triangle of faith, finance, and flesh. And for most people, love was the least reliable of the three. In the Middle Ages, weddings united land and lineage long before they ever united hearts. If medieval marriage was a business deal, the church was both the accountant and the enforcer. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had claimed full authority over who could marry, when they could marry, and under what conditions they could escape it, which was almost never. Marriage became a sacrament, sacred and binding in the eyes of God, not just man. Once the vows were spoken, there was no undoing them, not by king, not by pope, not by tears. This divine monopoly gave priests extraordinary control over people's private lives. They determined what counted as lawful love and what was sin. The rules were strict. No close relatives, no bigamy, no secret weddings, and, officially, no sex before the priest's blessing. Cousins within 7 degrees of kinship were forbidden from marrying. though in practice nobles simply paid the church for a dispensation to make it all go away. Money, as usual, made sin negotiable. The church's doctrine clashed constantly with human nature. Husbands wanted heirs, wives wanted safety, lovers wanted freedom. Yet the church demanded chastity before marriage, fidelity after it, and no divorce at all. The only acceptable escape was death or annulment, and annulments were rarer than miracles. To earn one, you had to prove the marriage was invalid from the start, that one party was underage, coerced, impotent, or already married to someone else. For the average peasant, that was impossible. For a noble, it was a matter of paperwork and persuasion. Confession booths became quiet battlegrounds of conscience. Priests heard endless tales of infidelity, unwanted unions, and broken vows. Sins that couldn't be undone but had to be forgiven again and again. The church preached that marriage tamed lust and preserved moral order, yet it also made hypocrisy universal. Kings who outlawed adultery in their lands often practiced it in their castles, with the church looking the other way for a generous donation. The result was a society bound by holy law but driven by human weakness. The church claimed to protect marriage's sanctity, yet its own rigidity turned it into a gilded cage. Behind every eternal vow was a quiet prayer for escape, and that, too, became part of the medieval soul. Nowhere was marriage more strategic or more dangerous than in royal courts. A king's bedchamber was a battlefield disguised as a bridal suite. Every royal marriage was a treaty in silk, a calculated move meant to bind kingdoms, silence enemies, or claim thrones through bloodline. Love, when it appeared, was accidental and often inconvenient. Kings and queens rarely chose their partners. Their advisors, bishops, and ambassadors did that for them. A match between a French princess and an English prince could mean peace, or more often, 20 years of war. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. Married first to Louis VII of France, she brought with her a massive inheritance of lands. But when their union failed to produce a male heir, the church allowed an annulment. Within months, she married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England, turning her dowry into the spark that fueled centuries of Anglo-French conflict. Royal weddings were public theatre. Parades of power meant to impress both God and the people. But behind the veils and banners lay distrust. Queens were expected to be fertile, silent, and loyal. Kings were expected to be strong, dominant, and discreet about their infidelities. When they weren't, scandal followed like a plague. A barren queen could face exile or annulment. A king's adultery was seen as a matter of private conscience. Hypocrisy was written into royal law. Marriages often served as chess pieces long after the ceremony. Monarchs used them to legitimize conquest or absorb rivals. A widow could be forced to remarry to strengthen a dynasty, even if she despised her suitor. The powerful sometimes even claimed spiritual kinship to block marriages that threatened their interests, an ecclesiastical excuse for political sabotage. And when love actually appeared in the royal court, it was treated like a disease. Affairs could ignite wars. Rumours of illegitimacy could destroy dynasties. The sanctity of marriage was preached in cathedrals, but betrayed in royal chambers. In truth, the crown never married for affection. It married for advantage. Every royal wedding was a gamble, and every royal affair a potential revolution. In medieval Europe, passion was treason, marriage was strategy, and love, when it came, was the most dangerous game of all. If marriage in the Middle Ages was duty, adultery was rebellion, and a common one. The Church thundered that infidelity was a mortal sin, punishable by hellfire, yet half of Europe's nobility seemed to have missed the sermon. Kings, knights, and even priests found ways to bend virtue around temptation. And while the Church tried to control bodies through confession and law, desire found its own underground economy. Among nobles, affairs were practically political. A king's mistress might wield more influence than a bishop. Royal lovers whispered secrets that could topple dynasties. When King Philip the Fair of France accused the wives of his own knights, the Templar-connected daughters-in-law, of adultery, it wasn't about morality. It was about power. By shaming them, he stripped their husbands of political standing. Scandal, in royal courts, was a weapon sharper than any sword. For ordinary folk, adultery carried harsher consequences. A peasant woman caught straying could be beaten, shaved, or paraded through the village in disgrace. Her husband risked ridicule, but his reputation usually survived. The imbalance was brutal. Men's lust was tolerated, women's was condemned. Medieval society treated female virtue like currency. Once spent, it was gone forever. But not all passion hid in shame. The culture of courtly love, born in the 12th century among troubadours and poets, turned adultery into an art form. Noblemen composed verses for married ladies, celebrating forbidden desire under the guise of chivalry. To love a woman you could not touch was considered the highest form of refinement, though in practice, many troubadours ignored that rule. The church tried to fight back with penitential laws and moral theatre. Priests warned that adulterers would burn eternally on spits of fire. Yet even some abbots kept mistresses behind monastery walls. Confession became a revolving door of sin and forgiveness, guilt and relapse. Adultery in the Middle Ages wasn't just lust. It was language, politics, and defiance. It exposed the hypocrisy of a society that demanded chastity yet sold indulgences. Everyone condemned it, yet nearly everyone participated in it. Beneath the surface of every solemn marriage vow, there pulsed the same unholy truth. Love and law had never spoken the same tongue. Divorce, in the medieval sense, didn't exist. To sever a marriage was to challenge God himself, and that rarely ended well. But where there were rules, there were loopholes, and the church's favourite was the annulment. It wasn't technically a divorce. It was a declaration that the marriage had never truly existed. For nobles and monarchs, it became the most elegant form of legal fiction ever invented. Annulments were built on the pretense of purity. The church argued that for a union to be valid, both partners had to freely consent, consummate the marriage, and be eligible under canon law. If one of those could be challenged, say, the bride was too young, or they were distant cousins, or the marriage had never been physically completed, a court might grant an annulment. The reality, however, depended less on theology and more on politics and gold. Kings exploited annulments like weapons. Henry II's son, Philip Augustus of France, famously abandoned his wife Ingeborg of Denmark just a day after their wedding, claiming she made him physically ill. He petitioned the church for an annulment on grounds of spiritual incompatibility, a claim so vague it bordered on comedy. When the Pope refused, Philip simply locked her away in a convent and married someone else anyway. In the medieval hierarchy of sin, royal desire usually outranked holy law. For ordinary people, annulments were fantasies. The process was expensive, bureaucratic, and required witnesses brave enough to testify about the most intimate details of a couple's life. Some cases dragged on for years, becoming public spectacles of humiliation. Women, in particular, suffered. If an annulment declared the marriage void, their children could be labelled illegitimate, stripped of inheritance and status in a single decree. Still, annulments served as a pressure valve for a society suffocated by its own morality. They allowed the powerful to rewrite vows when convenient, and the church to maintain its authority while pretending to uphold divine law. Everyone won, except the one being cast aside. Behind every annulment was a story of manipulation dressed in scripture. It was where confession met politics, where theology bent to influence, and where the sanctity of marriage became one more asset to be negotiated, sold, or erased. In the Middle Ages, scandal was a form of entertainment, and adultery, betrayal, or annulment could turn anyone, from queen to peasant, into public spectacle. Reputation was currency, and when it was tarnished, it spread faster than plague. The church preached morality from the pulpit, but gossip was the true religion of medieval Europe. And nowhere was it more devoutly practiced than in marriage scandals. When noble unions collapsed, it wasn't just a family issue, it was political theatre. Courtiers whispered, troubadours composed songs, and chroniclers etched the drama into history. Take King Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their union began as a pious alliance and ended in a disaster of temperaments. She was bold, educated, and independent. He was devout, hesitant, and dull. Their annulment in 1152 shocked Europe, not because it was rare, but because Eleanor immediately married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England. France's queen had switched thrones in a single season, setting the stage for centuries of bloodshed between their heirs. Public fascination with such stories was insatiable. The same church that forbade gossip also fueled it, reading confessions aloud as moral lessons. Accusations of adultery could ruin noblewomen, even when unproven. The daughters-in-law of Philip the Fair, locked in the Tower of Nesle scandal, were publicly accused of infidelity. 2 were imprisoned, 1 executed, while the men involved naturally escaped with mild punishment. For queens, virtue wasn't just a moral ideal, it was political armour. One rumour could destroy an entire dynasty. Even among commoners, marital scandal meant social death. A wife accused of unfaithfulness might be forced to do public penance, barefoot, carrying candles, her hair shorn. Husbands, meanwhile, could boast of their conquests in taverns without consequence. The double standard was as medieval as the cathedrals that housed its sermons. Scandal had a paradoxical power. It could shame, but it could also immortalize. Those who defied the church's cold expectations, like Eleanor, like countless unnamed lovers, became legends of defiance cloaked in sin. Medieval marriage may have been bound by law and faith, but gossip made sure no one ever forgot its failures. In a world obsessed with salvation, a good scandal was the closest thing to immortality. Every era has its rebels, and in the Middle Ages, rebellion often came disguised as love. Behind the iron bars of duty and piety, forbidden romance flickered like candlelight, fragile but defiant. These were not fairy tales of knights and maidens. They were acts of quiet revolution against the iron grip of church and crown. One of the most infamous examples was the affair between King Henry II of England and Rosamund Clifford, a noblewoman celebrated for her beauty. Their relationship became the scandal of Europe. Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, brilliant, powerful, and unwilling to be humiliated, allegedly had Rosamund confined to a convent, where she died under suspicious circumstances. The story spread like wildfire, retold by poets who turned sin into legend. To the church, it was adultery. To the people, it was tragedy painted in silk and blood. Forbidden love wasn't limited to royalty. Clergymen, sworn to celibacy, were notorious for breaking their vows. Many kept secret wives, known as concubinae, living quietly near monasteries. Bishops denounced such mortal corruption, yet the practice was so widespread that councils repeatedly issued decrees against it, to little effect. Love, apparently, was a harder vice to conquer than greed. For commoners, forbidden love was often an act of desperation. A serf could not legally marry outside his lord's domain without permission, and runaway lovers risked flogging or imprisonment. Yet stories abound of couples fleeing into the woods, exchanging vows before God alone. Hand fasting, they called it. To them, love sanctified itself, with or without the church's blessing. These forbidden unions were dangerous, but they were also human. They revealed a truth medieval law tried to bury. Passion couldn't be legislated. Whether in royal chambers or peasant cottages, love ignored the chains of hierarchy and faith. And though many of these stories ended in ruin, a poisoned cup, a public penance, an excommunication, they left behind something more enduring than scandal. They carved cracks into the facade of divine order, reminding the medieval world that even under crowns, habits, and armour, the human heart refused to obey. When medieval marriages crumbled, the emotional cost was immense, but the social and financial price was even higher. In a world where marriage was sacred, Breaking it was a form of blasphemy. And yet, the desperate still tried. The outcome was rarely fair, often cruel, and always public. For noble families, separation was warfare wrapped in velvet. A husband might send his wife to a convent for her soul's safety, which conveniently freed him to pursue another alliance. A wife seeking freedom had far fewer options. She could flee, appeal to the church, or vanish into the protection of powerful relatives. The church occasionally allowed separatio a mensa et thoro, a separation from bed and board. This meant the couple could live apart, but were still married in the eyes of God. No remarriage, no fresh start, just a colder, quieter prison. Money made everything more complicated. Dowries had to be repaid, lands divided, servants reassigned. Women who left their husbands risked losing everything, even their children. Medieval law viewed offspring as the husband's property, especially among the nobility, where heirs were political assets. Some desperate mothers disguised themselves to see their children secretly, relying on servants' mercy. The emotional cruelty of sacred marriage was often its sharpest punishment. Among the poor, separations were simpler, but no less painful. A man might just leave and never return. Villages whispered, priests scolded, but life went on. A deserted wife might take another partner unofficially, a common law arrangement tolerated as long as it didn't cause scandal. The church could rage from the pulpit, but it couldn't patrol every hearth. For women of rank, escape required influence or scandal. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, endured years of humiliation before securing an annulment from King Louis VII. Few others could dream of such freedom. Most women who defied their husbands were crushed by legal and spiritual shame. In the end, separation in the Middle Ages was never about healing. It was about survival. It exposed the double standards that ruled both bed and altar. Men could stray, annul, or abandon. Women could only endure. The church called this divine order. But for countless broken souls, it was simply injustice wearing a halo. By the end of the Middle Ages, marriage, adultery, and divorce had woven themselves into a complicated moral tapestry, half sacred, half scandalous. What began as a divine union had become a system of control, binding hearts with politics and law. Yet through all the hypocrisy, a quiet evolution was underway. The medieval world, so obsessed with purity and order, had unknowingly laid the groundwork for the modern idea of love. The church, for all its rigidity, had at least given marriage permanence, a counterweight to the chaos of feudal life. It insisted that even kings must bow to vows, that consent mattered, and that marriage was more than property exchange. Ironically, those same rules also imprisoned countless people in loveless unions. But within those constraints, individuals began to demand something new: affection. The idea that marriage should involve love was radical, even dangerous, yet it was spreading like wildfire through songs, poems, and whispered dreams. Courtly love had started as noble flirtation, but by the 15th century, it had become moral expectation. Men were told to woo, not just wed. Women began to see themselves not merely as possessions, but as partners, at least in theory. The poetry of the troubadours, once considered frivolous, began to shape real human longing. It was no longer enough to have a wife. One had to love her. The seed of romance had been planted in soil once ruled by contract. But the darker legacies endured. The laws of annulment, the double standards of adultery, and the absence of true divorce continued to define European society for centuries. Women's reputations remained fragile glass, men's sins easily forgiven. Even kings who redefined the rules, like Henry VIII centuries later, did so for ambition, not justice. Still, the contradictions of medieval marriage left behind more than broken vows. They left questions. What is love without freedom? What is faith without mercy? The medieval heart lived under heavy chains, but it never stopped yearning. And that yearning, for choice, for equality, for love unblessed yet pure, became the first whisper of modern romance. Out of the politics of passion, the human soul slowly rediscovered itself. In 17th century Kyoto, amid the fading glory of samurai rule, a new world quietly awakened, one dedicated not to war or politics, but to pleasure. The shogunate, weary of rebellion and eager to control vice, decided that desire itself needed order. Thus were born the yukaku, licensed pleasure quarters, where passion could be taxed, beauty could be regulated, and illusion could be perfected. The most famous of these was Shimabara, Kyoto's own walled paradise. Within its gates, the ordinary rules of society softened. Merchants mingled with samurai, poets with courtesans, monks with men who forgot their vows. Lanterns glowed like fireflies along narrow alleys, leading to tea houses where laughter floated through paper screens. It was a self-contained universe, a city of dreams sealed off from the rigid world beyond its wooden gates. But the yukaku were not mere brothels, they were theatres of refinement, where pleasure was staged with precision and artistry. Courtesans, or oiran, were trained from childhood not only in seduction, but in poetry, calligraphy, and the tea ceremony. They memorized the art of conversation as carefully as a samurai studied swordsmanship. A night with an oiran was less a transaction and more a performance, an elegant play of wit, fragrance, and illusion. Kyoto's floating world, or ukiyo, took its name from a Buddhist term meaning transient world. Yet in this context, transience became liberation, a chance to forget death, duty, and the heavy chains of honor. Here, one could drift between reality and fantasy, savouring beauty that was never meant to last. The sound of shamisen strings echoed from tea-house balconies, mingling with the scent of incense and plum blossoms. Still, beneath the painted smiles and silken sleeves, the yukaku were built on contradictions. They promised freedom within walls, refinement born from control, and love that could be bought but never possessed. Every illusion carried a shadow. The women who entertained emperors and merchants alike lived as both artists and prisoners, their elegance masking a lifetime of discipline and debt. And yet, Kyoto's pleasure quarters endured for centuries, preserved like a dream that refused to wake. They became the heart of Japan's cultural identity, where beauty was ritual, and every glance, gesture, and breath was art. Before geisha refined the art of entertainment, the heart of Kyoto's pleasure quarters belonged to the oiran, the high courtesans of the Edo era. They were not simply women of desire, but arbiters of fashion, poetry, and elegance. To enter their presence was to step into a painting, every movement rehearsed, every word chosen as carefully as a brushstroke on silk. Yet behind their lacquered poise lay lives dictated by discipline, debt, and illusion. The journey to becoming an oiran began in childhood. Young girls, often sold by impoverished families, were taken into okaya, boarding houses run by strict proprietresses. There they trained for years under relentless supervision. Their lessons included dancing, shamisen performance, calligraphy, flower arrangement, and tea ceremony. Everything that could transform a child into a living work of art. Mistakes were punished, progress rewarded with praise that was always conditional. By the time they came of age, these women could recite poems, play music, and charm nobles who considered them equals in wit, if not in status. But prestige came at a cost. The oiran lived under rigid hierarchy, with only a handful, the taiyu, attaining celebrity status. These elite courtesans could command the wealthiest clients, their company negotiated like political treaties. A visit to a taiyu was a privilege reserved for men of immense status, who were expected to match her refinement, intelligence, and expense. Courting her could take months, requiring gifts, letters, and formal introductions. The taiyu didn't chase desire, she dictated it. Her appearance was legendary: towering platform sandals, kimono layered like armour, and a coiffure so elaborate it required assistance to maintain. To walk through Shimabara's streets, she moved slowly and deliberately, a procession of grace surrounded by attendants. Passers-by bowed in silence, not out of lust, but reverence. Yet behind this performance lay a quieter truth. For all their status, oiran were commodities bound by contract. They could entertain poets and samurai, but not love freely. Each smile was rehearsed, each secret carefully sold. And still, within their gilded cages, they created art so exquisite it transcended its origins. The oiran became both muse and myth, women who turned captivity into culture, their names whispered long after their world faded into memory. As Kyoto's pleasure quarters evolved, a new figure emerged from the shadows, less bound by luxury, more defined by art. The geisha, literally person of the arts, began not as courtesans, but as entertainers. They played music, poured tea, told stories, and kept conversation flowing when words faltered. Yet over time, their grace, intellect, and subtle allure began to eclipse the courtesans they once served. The first geisha were men, witty performers hired to amuse guests while they waited for oiran. But women soon mastered the art, and by the 18th century, female geisha had transformed Kyoto's nightlife. Unlike the heavily adorned taiyu, the geisha embodied restraint. Their beauty was minimalist: pale skin, simple kimono, and understated hair. They didn't dazzle with jewels, they captivated with timing, expression, and mystery. Where the oiran offered fantasy, the geisha offered conversation. Training began young, under the guidance of a okasan, or mother of the tea house. Apprentices, known as maiko, learned to dance, sing, play the shamisen, and master the unspoken rules of social subtlety: when to laugh softly, when to lower their eyes, when to turn silence into charm. The transformation from maiko to geisha was marked by ceremony. The hairstyle simplified, the makeup softened, the innocence replaced by composure. The geisha's role was not transactional in the same way as the oiran. They could entertain the same guests night after night, without promise or physical exchange. Their worth came from refinement, the ability to make others feel seen, relaxed, and important. A true geisha could command attention without ever raising her voice. Her gestures were poetry, her presence, performance. Still, the line between art and desire was delicate. Many men fell in love with geisha, imagining romance where only illusion existed. Patronage often blurred into intimacy, though the geisha remained emotionally untouchable. Her livelihood depended on maintaining that fragile balance between affection and distance. By the late Edo period, geisha had replaced oiran as the queens of the ukiyo, the floating world. They represented Japan's transition from the gilded excess of feudal pleasure to the quiet elegance of artistic mastery. Where once beauty was bought, now it was performed, and perfection, as always in Kyoto, was the most seductive illusion of all. In Kyoto's pleasure quarters, nothing was ever entirely real. Not the smiles, not the affection, not even the names. Everything was artifice, and that was precisely the point. The ukiyo, the floating world, promised escape, not truth. Guests entered its tea houses not to find love, but to forget the weight of obligation. And the women who entertained them, whether geisha or maiko, became masters of illusion, sculptors of mood and memory. Every detail was deliberate. The lighting was soft enough to flatter faces and blur age. Incense drifted through the air, erasing the smells of sake and sweat. Conversations followed rhythms designed to soothe pride and provoke fascination. Even silence had choreography. When a geisha poured tea, she did it with the same grace a priest used to bless an altar. Every gesture carried unspoken meaning: a raised sleeve, a subtle smile, a pause between words. The art lay not in seduction, but in control. To outsiders, the geisha's poise seemed effortless, but it was built on discipline. Behind every evening's laughter were hours of practice, perfecting shamisen chords, memorizing dance steps, learning the psychology of men who needed to feel powerful even while being gently handled. A single misstep, a laugh too loud, an expression too familiar, could ruin her mystique. The illusion depended on balance. closeness without attachment, grace without surrender. Yet not all illusions served pleasure. For many geisha, it was also a mask for survival. Beneath the painted calm lay exhaustion, debt, and loneliness. Their profession demanded emotional fluency, the ability to listen to confessions without judgment, to pretend affection without expectation. They became confidants, muses, and therapists for samurai and merchants who carried the burdens of power. And though men left the tea house lighter, the women remained, resetting the scene for the next performance. Still, within that endless cycle of illusion, something profound emerged. The geisha transformed fleeting moments into timeless art. She turned transience, that Buddhist idea of impermanence, into beauty itself. The floating world was never meant to last, but that was its secret strength. In a city obsessed with control and tradition, Kyoto's geisha mastered the one art the samurai never could: how to make ephemerality feel eternal. Inside Kyoto's pleasure quarters, art was the true currency. The geisha's world revolved around mastery, of conversation, performance, and most importantly, atmosphere. Her domain was not the brothel, but the ochaya, the tea house, where pleasure took the form of subtlety. Here, entertainment was not loud or vulgar. It unfolded like a poem, slow, deliberate, and layered with meaning. The tea ceremony lay at the centre of this ritualized world. To outsiders it looked simple, a woman pouring hot water over powdered green tea, but every movement followed centuries of tradition. The way the geisha turned the cup, the measured silence between gestures, even the angle of her gaze, all were choreographed acts of grace. The guest's role was to receive, not to possess. To drink from her hands was to enter a moment of harmony, fleeting and sacred. When night deepened and sake replaced tea, the atmosphere transformed. The sound of the shamisen, a three-stringed lute, echoed through the dim light, playful or melancholic depending on the mood. A maiko might rise to dance, her sleeves flowing like water, her steps recounting tales of love, loss, or rebirth. Each movement was symbolic. A tilt of the head could suggest longing, a turn of the wrist, surrender. The audience, often intoxicated yet entranced, watched as the boundary between art and emotion dissolved. Music, poetry, and conversation blended seamlessly. A skilled geisha could flatter without flattery, tease without insult, and draw laughter from a samurai who hadn't smiled in years. Her power lay not in the body, but in the mind. The ability to read a room and control it with charm. To be dull or impatient was social suicide. The geisha's grace made her indispensable at gatherings where deals were struck and alliances cemented. To outsiders, this might have looked like play, but to the women of the pleasure quarters, it was labour. Art performed under pressure. The refinement was real, but so was the exhaustion. Yet the geisha's endurance turned art into armour. In every note, every pour of tea, she declared silent mastery over a world that sought to define her. Through elegance, she reigned, not with force, but with presence. Beneath Kyoto's serene lantern light, the pleasure quarters were not just sanctuaries of art, they were arenas of power. Every guest who entered an ochaya brought more than curiosity. He brought politics, wealth, and ambition. Patronage was the bloodstream of the geisha world, and every smile, every shared cup of sake, carried the weight of negotiation. A geisha's livelihood depended on her patrons, known as dana. These men, merchants, officials, or retired samurai, provided financial support in exchange for companionship and prestige. A dana might pay for her kimono, her training, even her lodging. But this wasn't ownership, it was status. To have a geisha as one's companion meant sophistication, proof of taste and influence. And for the geisha, a generous patron meant security in a profession built on uncertainty. But relationships within this world were governed by unspoken rules. The dana could not demand affection, only access. Intimacy, if it existed, was bound by etiquette, concealed beneath layers of politeness and ceremony. To display jealousy or dominance in public would ruin both reputations. The geisha's power lay in her restraint. Her refusal to be claimed elevated her above simple indulgence. Behind these refined exchanges, however, pulsed a ruthless economy. The okiya that managed geisha operated like businesses, tracking every debt, the cost of kimonos, instruments, and lessons. A woman might owe her house thousands of yen before she could call herself independent. The favour of a patron wasn't just luxury, it was survival. Losing one could mean slipping into obscurity. Politics, too, seeped into this floating world. The shogunate tolerated the pleasure quarters because they offered controlled release, a place where samurai could forget politics without causing rebellion. Yet the most powerful men often used these spaces to forge alliances or whisper secrets. A single geisha, trusted by the right men, could carry influence greater than any courtier, but every favour had a price. Patronage could turn into possession, affection into leverage. The geisha walked a tightrope, balancing gratitude and independence, charm and manipulation. Her success was measured not by wealth alone, but by how gracefully she could survive dependence without surrendering herself to it. In Kyoto's world of artful illusion, the most dangerous game wasn't seduction, it was freedom. Beneath the shimmering silk and painted serenity, the pleasure quarters hid lives that were anything but effortless. To the outside world, geisha and maiko embodied grace, living works of art untouched by hardship. Yet behind the scenes, their world was one of strict discipline, silent hierarchies, and relentless performance. Every smile had a schedule, every gesture an expectation. The okiya, or geisha house, functioned less like a home and more like an institution. The okasan, the house mother, ruled with precision and authority. She oversaw finances, arranged patronage, and enforced obedience. The girls under her care were investments. From the moment a maiko entered the house, her future was a ledger of debts, lessons in dance, shamisen, kimono fittings, hairdressing, each recorded, each owed. Freedom came only after years of service and countless performances. Daily life followed an exacting rhythm. Mornings began early, with hours of training in music, etiquette, and movement. Meals were simple and quick. Leisure was rare. The slightest mistake, a misplayed note, a stumble in dance, could invite scolding or humiliation. Even appearance was a form of labour. The maiko's iconic hairstyle took hours to construct, heavy with wax and ornaments, and she was forbidden to sleep lying down lest it collapse. The beauty admired by patrons was maintained through discomfort, even pain. Despite the hardships, sisterhood formed among the women. Older geisha mentored apprentices, teaching them how to navigate the unspoken rules of men and money. Bonds forged in shared exhaustion became quiet acts of rebellion, a reminder that, even in captivity, solidarity could exist. Yet rivalry simmered too. Success in the pleasure quarters meant survival, and competition for clients and prestige was constant. Emotionally, the toll was immense. A geisha was trained to mask her feelings, to smile through heartbreak, to charm those she despised, to pretend contentment while yearning for escape. Love was dangerous, sometimes forbidden. Attachment could cost her reputation or livelihood. Still, many took pride in their craft. They were not victims, but professionals, artists who had mastered endurance as an art form. Beneath the silken facade was resilience, quiet and unyielding. The floating world may have belonged to illusion, but its women built their dignity in reality, through grace under pressure and survival behind a painted smile. As the 19th century unfolded, Kyoto's pleasure quarters began to fade like a lantern at dawn. The floating world, once the centre of elegance and illusion, found itself caught in the tide of modernization. The samurai were vanishing, the merchant class was rising, and Japan itself was turning its gaze toward the west. The yukaku, with its silken rituals and rigid hierarchies, seemed like a relic from a dream the country was trying to forget. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought sweeping reform, and with it, discomfort. The government sought to present Japan as a modern nation, free from the immorality of licensed pleasure. Brothels were restricted, courtesans lost status, and the word oiran itself began to vanish from polite conversation. The women who once held power through art and allure were forced into obscurity, their traditions rebranded or banned. The floating world began to sink, yet not everything perished. The geisha, ever adaptable, redefined themselves. No longer bound to the fading world of political patronage, they turned their art toward entertainment and preservation. They became cultural ambassadors, curators of Japan's aesthetic soul. Where once they played for samurai and poets, they now performed for diplomats and aristocrats. The illusion endured, but its purpose had changed, no longer an escape from duty, but a reminder of refinement amid change. Kyoto's Hanamachi, the flower districts, survived where others fell silent. Places like Gion and Pontoccio transformed into living museums of elegance, where art thrived without scandal. The geisha evolved into guardians of heritage, keeping alive the dances, songs, and customs that modernization threatened to erase. Even as railways roared and factories rose, the soft strum of the shamisen continued to echo through narrow alleyways, a whisper of the old ukiyo. Still, the transition was bittersweet. Many women who once wore silk and painted faces found themselves discarded by time, their art reduced to spectacle. What had begun as rebellion and beauty became nostalgia, a performance for memory rather than pleasure. The floating world had not died, it had transformed. Beneath the electric glow of New Japan, Kyoto's pleasure quarters remained, half shadow, half echo, reminders of a time when illusion itself was the highest art, and beauty, no matter how fleeting, was worth everything. Today, the ghosts of Kyoto's pleasure quarters still breathe through the narrow alleys of Gion. The wooden facades, paper lanterns, and quiet footfalls of geiko, Kyoto's term for geisha, preserve the last traces of the ukiyo, the floating world. Time has eroded the boundaries between art and memory, but the spirit of that lost realm endures, elegant, melancholy, and unyieldingly beautiful. Modern visitors to Kyoto often imagine the geisha as symbols of erotic mystery, unaware that they now stand as the protectors of a nearly vanished art form. The performances that once entertained samurai and poets have become living archives of Japan's aesthetic soul. Every gesture, every note on the shamisen carries centuries of refinement. The geiko of Gion no longer live in a world of politics and patronage. Theirs is a quieter, more fragile existence, sustained by tourism and cultural reverence rather than power. Yet the illusion remains. To see a maiko, an apprentice geisha, gliding down Hanamikoji Street at twilight is to witness time itself hesitate. Her ornate kimono, her slow, deliberate steps, her downcast gaze, all crafted to preserve a beauty that refuses to modernize. In that moment, Kyoto becomes both past and present, dream and reality. It is performance as preservation, illusion reborn as identity. But behind the beauty lingers a haunting silence. The geisha houses are fewer now, the apprentices rarer. Many young women see the life as a gilded cage, its demands too rigid for the modern age. And yet, those who remain continue their work with quiet pride, knowing that they are the final guardians of a centuries-old language, one spoken through elegance, restraint, and grace. The floating world, once an escape from duty, now survives as an act of devotion. Where courtesans once sold dreams, geisha now sell remembrance of a time when art and emotion existed in perfect balance. Kyoto itself seems to protect this memory, refusing to let the neon of the new century fully erase its shadows. And so the illusion endures, not as deception, but as truth preserved in silk and song. The pleasure quarters of Kyoto may have vanished in form, but their echo lingers, a soft, eternal whisper reminding Japan that even the most fleeting beauty can outlast time.